Hi everyone, thanks for tuning in to the last video for Unit 5 on urbanization. Here we're going to talk about cities and how they're growing, how they're changing, what are the environmental problems that they pose, but also what are their benefits and how can we make sure that our cities are environmentally sustainable going forward. A great example of the general trend we see with cities is these photos here of aerial photos of Las Vegas in 1986 to 2013, and you can see that the city has grown substantially. And Las Vegas isn't the only city that fits this pattern. It's a pretty common phenomenon that we see with cities across the globe. They're growing, they're expanding, and they're spreading. If we look at the population of individuals, demographics, and where they live in 1850, we see that only about 2% of people on Earth live in cities. Whereas by the time we get to 2006, that's almost 50% of people live in cities. So a pretty dramatic change in that like 155 years or so. And if we look at the whole population of the world, today, more or less, we see that over half of the world's population lives in cities, and that number grows each day. In the United States, it's even higher, with over 80% of individuals living in an urban area. This is a pretty substantial indicator of how we use our land and how people live in the United States and around the globe as well. When we think about cities, there are a lot of reasons why you might want to leave a rural area and move to the city. So for example, in rural areas there might be poverty, lack of good land to grow food, lack of jobs, famine, war, or poor education that cause you to leave, they push you to leave. Whereas you're attracted to urban areas because of opportunities in employment, affordable housing, diversity of food and educational opportunities, better access to healthcare, entertainment, and freedom as well. A city, it provides a lot of anonymity, and also, for example, has been a really important sort of stronghold for the LGBTQ plus community to find and make their space as they push forward for their rights in the United States. And if we look at a map showing urban versus rural in the United States, we can see that the warmer the color, this red color represents a large central urban area, whereas a greener area, not so much. We can see, there are dots of urban areas all around the country, and those are where cities are, right? New York, Hartford, Boston, Providence, etc. San Francisco, LA, Salt Lake City. These are the major cities, and where most of the population lives are in these red and orange dots. There are some problems, though, with urban development, environmentally speaking. First of all, if you've got a lot of people living in a small area, that means high density, and that means a high density of pollution, not only sewage waste, but greenhouse gas emissions and noise pollution. And high density also means increased rates of disease outbreaks. We will also see a few other things that I'll talk about, including the heat island effect, saltwater intrusion, increased runoff, and the need to import food. First of all, noise pollution sounds kind of silly, but it's a legitimate thing. Excessive noise can lead to increased stress or hearing loss or even damage to hearing. It can decrease concentration, and it can have significant impacts not just on humans, but on animal populations as well, messing with their migration or communication or even mating rituals. Second issue with urban development are urban heat islands. At the beginning of the year, we learned about albedo. We ran around outside with thermometers and measured the temperature of different surfaces. And we found that dark surfaces like pavement tend to be hotter. They are darker in color, so they absorb more sunlight. And a city is basically covered in surfaces like that, right? They trap heat during the day. There is very little vegetation to cool the air. And they have a lot of surfaces with a low albedo, so they're reflecting a lot or absorbing a lot of light and heat, and then at night they're radiating that heat. So cities tend to be a lot hotter than the surrounding area, which is why they call it an urban heat island, because it's like a little island of heat. And it can be even different within the city as well, as I'll talk about in a little bit. Not the whole city isn't necessarily the same temperature, it can fluctuate. Here's another diagram showing the same thing. And heat is pretty dangerous. It's actually the most lethal weather system or weather issue that the United States faces, killing over 12,000 people per year. So the urban heat island is no joke. It has disastrous consequences for the people living in that area. A third issue with urban areas is something called saltwater intrusion. It's basically this idea that as we pump fresh water from the aquifers underneath us, we're decreasing the pressure in this area. We're creating an area of low pressure, and if the city's near the coast, it's going to pull more water from deeper within the soil, and some salt water from the ocean might actually end up intruding or percolating into the soil and end up within the groundwater that we are extracting. Right, so basically we're extracting this water, and as we do that, we're decreasing the level, the water table of the fresh groundwater. And when we do that, that's also going to decrease the water pressure. So salt water is going to flow inward towards that area of low pressure and could get pumped out as well. That's not very good because obviously we don't want to be drinking salt water. The major problem that we're going to talk about with cities is urban runoff. This idea that they're covered with a lot of impervious surfaces, things like asphalt or tar or rooftops, things that don't absorb water. Water puddles up in those areas. Whereas a forest, for example, has got trees and grass and shrubs and roots and soil systems. So most of the water is getting absorbed by those organisms and infiltrating into the soil. A very small component is running off and eroding. Whereas in a city, we see a lot of runoff happening. In fact, a typical city will generate about 5 times more runoff than a forest of the same amount of size, which is substantial. And the reason for that, like I said, is soil. In the city, there is no soil. In the forest, there is. And the roots and the soil structure helps to trap and distribute water, filter it slowly through the ground, and promote the water cycle. In the city, we don't get that. There are a lot of impervious surfaces that prevent rain from being absorbed into the ground. So instead, we have to pipe it out through sewage drains and stuff like that. Right? A lot of the drains that you see, storm drains, aren't for actually sewage, as I just said they were, stupidly. They're for rainwater, collecting rainwater and making sure that it doesn't flood the streets. And urban runoff, in particular, can be quite substantially problematic, environmentally anyway, because not only does it contribute to erosion, but it can also lead to substantial flooding within the city, and it can pick up and carry pollutants. Think about all the stuff that is in a possible parking lot, right? There's a porta potty, the car is leaking oil and gas, there's fuel, maybe pesticides are being applied, right? There's a dumpster there. All of that stuff is getting carried by runoff into a storm drain, which then gets dumped into a local stream or river and ends up in the water, in the ocean, right? So that's pretty detrimental to the organisms living in that ecosystem. And this is something that we see in terms of flooding in parking lots all the time, right? There are puddles all over the place, and when it can get really severe, like with a hurricane or something, you can actually get major floods like this one. Thankfully, there's a lot we can do to mitigate urban runoff and help reduce the issue. One thing is permeable pavement, right? Creating surfaces on the ground that allow water to pass through. I'll show a video in class. It could be as simple as gravel or this sort of interlaced lattice with soil in between the area of granite or whatever that is, that allows water to pass through. A simpler solution is just to have more soil and more vegetation, right? So that way we have more organisms who can absorb and cycle that water. And instead of building our cities out and increasing the footprint, right, build up, build taller. That way we're using less land devoted to these buildings and impervious surfaces, right? If we look at, for example, Atlanta versus Barcelona, they have roughly the same population, about 5.2 million. But Atlanta takes up 4,280 square kilometers, whereas Barcelona only takes up 162, right? And it's got way less emissions, carbon emissions from public transportation because everything is more compacted. Now, there are problems with that, of course, as well, but it's going to help with urban runoff substantially. And the last problem related to what I was just talking about is that in a city, there's not a lot of land to grow food, so they often have to truck that food in from other places, and that is going to release carbon emissions to transport that food. But thankfully, we've started to develop and are continuing to develop vertical farming, which would allow us to farm within urban areas indoors, reduce the the footprint of the farm and allow us to also then reduce the transport costs. If the produce you're eating is being grown 2 blocks down the street, that's a lot better than having it shipped all the way from California. And of course, there are other benefits of urban development. Generally speaking, although it is a concentrated area, there is actually, per person, lower CO2 emissions if you live in a city because you're using public transportation more on average. They take up less land. The delivery of goods and services is much more efficient because everything is more compact. They are hubs of innovation environmentally and technologically, and they are rapidly moving towards more sustainable structures, and both in terms of the architecture of buildings, but also in terms of designing neighborhoods. Additionally, though, what we see is although urban areas are becoming more sustainable, we still see a lot of people leaving cities and moving into suburban areas. And this is something called urban sprawl. As cities grow, like that picture of Las Vegas I showed you at the beginning, the city itself doesn't grow. The outer edges of it are suburbs, right? Which is probably most likely where you live, because most of America lives in suburbs, or at least a big chunk of them. And so as urban areas spread into rural areas, that middle ground between urban and rural is a suburb. And suburbs are growing substantially. Most of the population growth since 1950 has been in suburbs, and that's where a lot of American lives. It's like the American dream, have your pool and stuff in the backyard. Exurbs are like a suburb, but they're not connected to a city or a densely populated area. That's not super important, but you might see that term pop up. Urban, as cities have grown and suburbs have started to grow, a lot of that has to do with the development of the highway system in the 1950s, but also the appeal of suburbs, right? Suburbs are more expensive on average, right? There's less low-income or affordable housing, whereas in the city there's a lot more diversity of housing. The suburbs mostly have single-family homes. You have to probably commute to work, and therefore you probably have to have a car. Some people like that separation of home and work. And you can have more land, a yard, more space, and more privacy. There tends to be less crime, increased connection to nature, but also there tends to be this phenomenon of white flight, this idea that many white Americans, not all, but some, when black or people of color start to move into their neighborhoods, there's this phenomenon where the white people will leave those neighborhoods and move somewhere else. And that's a phenomenon known as white flight, and that is kind of what drove the formation of the suburbs in the 1950s. So suburban areas to live tend to be much more expensive in terms of not only the amount of land and the taxes that you're paying, but also in transportation, right? You have to own a car and pay for cars, etc. Whereas urbans tend to be cheaper, urban areas. In urban areas as well, there's as areas start to become degraded, again, we start to see sort of this white flight going on where people are pushed to leave the city because they don't like the way that their communities are changing. And there's some consequences of urban sprawl as suburbs start to get bigger and bigger, is that people are doing more driving. You drive more in the suburbs, which means you're using more fossil fuels and increasing pollution. It also means you're sitting more, which means you're more likely to have things like obesity, heart illness, diabetes, etc. Suburbs tend to use about 2 times as much land compared to in the city per person, so way more land use. It's going to replace farmland, so suddenly land that we could have used to farm is now being lived on, and it requires more infrastructure in terms of pipes and roads and fire and police departments and all that stuff, so that is all going to cost a lot more. So what can we do to make urban development more sustainable? There's this framework called Smart Growth, where they have 10 principles from the EPA that help develop environmentally sustainable, healthy urban communities. You don't have to know all of these, but you should be familiar with a few of them, right? First of all, one thing you could do is in cities have land that is mixed in terms of what it can be used for, so you don't have necessarily districts that all are sort of siloed into their own particular uses. That'll go hand in hand with another point I'll bring up in a second. which is this, right? By having mixed land use, you can also have a mixed housing availability, right? Some higher income house, middle income houses, lower income housing, right? So that way people from all different backgrounds can afford to live in the city, whereas in the suburbs it's just equally expensive no matter where you go, pretty much. You want to create neighborhoods that promote walking as opposed to driving or even public transport. You want to encourage your community to take part in decision making about development, so that way it's more egalitarian and democratic. Take advantage of building compact designs, right? Building up, not out. Building narrower and taller. Having your city have a sense of place, a distinct community character and meaning that people will be proud to live in and want to protect and be a part of. But at the same time, also preserve the open space, the green space, critical environmental areas, and push to have more green spaces in your community. Provide a wide variety of transportation, public transport, buses, taxis, trains, metros, etc., to give people alternatives to cars. Strengthen the development towards existing communities rather than building new communities, right? So if you destroy a dilapidated building, replace it with something. Or consider setting boundaries on your city, saying, hey, we're not going to grow past this limit, and instead focus on the area that we've already developed and continuing to develop that land. And make the decisions of the city should be cost effective, they should be predictable, and they should be fair for everybody. Remove as much red tape as possible, so that way the whole city can benefit and be a part of the decision making process. So these are like the 10 goals that drive sustainable urban development. What can you do? Plant trees. Ask your city government to plant more trees. Look into green roof programs. Fight to establish and preserve green spaces, and push for certification of buildings to be environmentally sustainable, less power usage, etc. Green roofs are more and more common. Greenwich Academy has one. It reduces urban runoff, increases primary productivity, increases air quality. It's aesthetically much more pleasing. Green roofs are really, really fantastic. So the last point I want to talk about is when we think about urbanization and all these changes and suggestions for the past, present, and future of urbanization, we have to talk about environmental justice as well. There is a history of discriminatory practices in terms of race, class, immigrants, etc., that have impacted the way that cities have developed. And it's relegated certain communities to high-risk areas in terms of flooding, heat islands, pollution, public housing, greenery, etc. So let's break this down. So I've talked about this before, redlining. Talked about it when we learned about Hurricane Katrina. And it's a housing discrimination practices put in place by the federal government from the 30s through the 60s or so. And what they did is they went through and they rated neighborhoods based on how risky it was to invest in that property. But risk was determined almost, not entirely, but almost exclusively based on the race of the people living there. And the inhabitants of red districts, which were the riskiest districts, were denied federal mortgages and also didn't receive the attention of the local town or state government in terms of meeting their needs, whether it's sanitation needs, building green spaces, affordable public housing, etc. There's this website here actually will allow us to take a look at some of these maps around the country. So green is the best, lowest risk, whereas red is the highest risk based on their criteria. And if we zoom in, let's zoom in on New York here. It's a lot of data here, so it takes a little time to load. And you can see they've superimposed these old maps onto the city. And you can hover over each district. So let's hover over this district in Manhattan. Let's click on it. And it will pop up with some details about, actually it will show the scan of the data from the date that it was taken and how this risk assessment was made. So let's see what kind of things they were writing. So this is a red area, right? And look, they've got a whole category for foreign-born families. 45+% are immigrants, right? That's bad based on their risk assessment, right? Which is obviously racist and problematic, right? And they describe some of the favorable things, right? And some of the detrimental things. This one is not too bad, but some of them are pretty obscene, right? So like foreign-born families, 39% Polish or Italian. Infiltration of the Negro, yes, 10% predominating, right? Favorable influence, paved streets, water and sewers. Detrimental influences, industry and railroad. And then there's some weird stuff. If you look at like detrimental influence, let's see. There was one I was looking at earlier. It was really bizarre. It was like character of the neighborhood. Some really vague things. But you can see they're talking about the demographics of the people who live there and using that to evaluate the riskiness of living there. You can also see that some of these other areas, right, are offensive odors coming from oil plants in New Jersey Shore opposite industrial encroachment, right? So it's not just about who lives there, but also what kind of activities are going on in that area. I should have marked these so I could have found them easily. Look at this one. Detrimental influences, no sewers, right? And 16% Polish and French immigrants. I'm looking for one that was like detrimental influences. It just explicitly said race of residents and was like the people don't seem proud to live here. But why would you feel proud to live there if it was a neighborhood that wasn't receiving funding or support or any sort of federal backing? Here they just say type of residence. I want to show you another example. And you'll use this website when we work on a project in class. This is Brockton, Massachusetts. And this red district, if you take a look, detrimental influences. Dump northwest of Calvary Cemetery, gasworks near railroad tracks in East Union Street, congested area of old houses, factory smoke, railroad tracks. So they, again, documenting not only the people who are living there, but the types of activities that are going on there. Let's get back to the slides here. We'll finish up. And so redlining, relegating these communities of color, poorer communities to these certain areas actually has detrimental impacts today related to the environment. An example is with the heat islands. Right. This is from a New York Times article. So this is Richmond, Virginia. These are all the red line neighborhoods. And if we look at the temperature of Richmond on whole, we see that these neighborhoods are also the ones that tend to be the hottest. And that's not coincidence, right? Red line districts, they weren't able to receive any federal backing in terms of mortgages, so it created this cycle of disenfranchisement and lack of wealth. And wealth is power. So these individuals don't necessarily have as much lobbying power to lobby for green spaces. They have less control or less sway over the landlord's agendas and what decisions they're making in terms of like planting trees in that area, right? So this is from that same article. In cities like Baltimore, Dallas, Denver, Miami, Portland, and New York, neighborhoods that are poor and have more residents of color can be 5 to 20 degrees hotter in the summer than wealthier, whiter parts of the same city. And across more than 100 cities, a recent study found formerly red-line neighborhoods are today 5 degrees hotter in summer on average than areas once favored for housing loans, with some cities seeing differences as large as 12 degrees. So red-line neighborhoods are suffering disproportionately because of cycles of intergenerational poverty and disenfranchisement from these federal laws. We also have in the past talked about with New Orleans how it has impacts on flooding and storms in relation to these communities being relegated to lower elevation areas closer to the levees, so more susceptible to flooding, right? These lower elevation areas tend to be formerly redlined communities. And it's also had a pretty substantial impact in relation to COVID-19 and the pandemic because of access to healthcare facilities and the cleanliness of the air and possible lung diseases like asthma that could develop from air pollution. So all of this stuff is interconnected. We're going to explore some of these topics over the next few days with a project looking at different cities across the country. But I'll leave it there for now. If you've got any questions, let me know.